Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first episode of our brand new Inside HubSpot Marketing webinar series. Apologies, for starting a couple of minutes late, but I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by my colleague Chelsea Hunersen here today. Chelsea is the social media manager here at HubSpot. She's the face behind all of our social media profiles and is the person who more often than not is answering your questions. Chelsea has a really deep knowledge of all things social. And in today's webinar, you're going to learn how Chelsea thinks about social media management from a HubSpot standpoint. You're going to learn some tips and tricks on managing your own social presence and how to really show some ROI within your own agency. If at any stage you'd like to join in the conversation, or if you have any questions at all that you would like answered, please tweet us at #InsideHubSpotMarketing, and we'll do our very best to get to them during and maybe towards the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, Chelsea, thanks again for being here. I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone who's joining us. I echo his apologies that we're getting started late, but I hope that everything that we cover today will make up for that. I know that getting started on some of these sometimes can also be when the most questions happen about audio and technical, so if there are any questions about things that you hear or see, please don't be afraid to go ahead and tweet with the hashtag. So I want to go ahead and get right into it. How to use social in 2017. I think one of the things that we talk to people the most about these days is because social is changing so quickly, what do we actually do? How should we think about really running our strategy on this network? So I'll go ahead and jump right in. First, let you know a little bit more about me. So again, my name is Chelsea. I do social media and video here at HubSpot. So what that means is I'm sort of working to plan out our social media strategy, but I'm also trying to figure out how video currently fits into social media and our marketing strategy at large. I've been at HubSpot for about 4 years now. Prior to working in social media, I worked in technical services, and prior to that, I worked at a startup doing social media as well. So I've covered all parts of the spectrum. So I want to go ahead first and just kind of talk about the social landscape in 2017. So as you may have noticed, things change pretty quickly in social media. Here are a couple of things that have changed in just the last couple of days. One, the most old news at this point is Instagram launched location filters. Location filters are kind of like the Snapchat geo filters, if you're familiar. The whole point is that you can add a location stamp to your story to let people know where you are. Snapchat announced filter analytics, which I believe just happened yesterday or really just this week. That is aimed at small businesses, trying to help them actually figure out who's using filters, trying to get a little bit more into the SMB market. Other things that happened, Facebook announced stories about 2 weeks ago, and a new social network came out called Mastodon. Supposedly, Mastodon is kind of like the anti-Twitter. I hear that it's a little bit better than Ello was, who is the anti-Facebook, if you are sort of familiar with that at all. But really the point that we're getting at here is that social media changes very quickly. So I appreciate everyone being here today to talk to us about it. But the good news is, as quickly as social media changes, it's not entirely a blank slate. It's actually more predictable than you think. And we'll talk a little bit today about how to actually think about social media and roll with some of these changes. So we'll get right into the agenda, things that we're going to talk about today, a little bit about the psychology and the landscape of social media, foundations of a good strategy. We're going to talk about getting the engagement piece right on social media, and why that's important, exploring some emerging social media, solving for scale, and then tips to get started the right way on social. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. We'll start with the psychology of social media. So when we talk about psychology of social media, I'm someone who kind of likes to look at this spread first. There's one thing that I think is usually really interesting to bring up. So this is something called the law of the double peaks. It's from our friends at Buffer. The whole concept of the law of the double peaks is that social media is relatively cyclical and trends are cyclical. And the way that things work is first something builds up organic steam and then it kind of gets mainstream and then it gets paid. The reason that that's really relevant is because what it tells us is that social networks kind of go through two peaks of popularity. There's kind of the organic peak and then there's the paid peak. And we as marketers kind of start to watch for it as it it hits sort of top of organic peak and as it gets into paid, because that's when it becomes really relevant for us. So this is where I see kind of networks falling on that today. We have some more established networks like Facebook and Twitter, and they're actually, doing pretty well in terms of stability. I think they are changing a little bit more than we usually see networks in that area change these days, but still, they're pretty consistently, as marketers, we know a lot about what we're going to do on those networks. And then you have networks like Instagram and you have Snapchat, and they're still kind of figuring it out. They're still integrating the paid portion. And so those are sort of networks that I think where the strategy is a little bit less clear, but we can still implement a couple of things that we know for sure. So let's go ahead and talk about the whole concept of, these are some of the most popular social networks today. We have Facebook, we have Snapchat, we have Instagram and WhatsApp. What I think is also interesting as we're talking about the cyclic nature of social media and the trends nature is that a lot of these social media trends are things that are not new to us, right? We've always sort of had this area where we want to make friends. We've done a lot of video watching. We've done a lot of picture sharing, and we've sent each other a lot of messages. I'm kind of pairing, you can see MySpace with Facebook. It's kind of a new iteration of MySpace. Snapchat is sort of a new viewing experience where we previously had YouTube. We have, new iterations of Instagram come from Flickr. It really is kind of tends to be the things that people like about social are the following. They like being able to share. They like being able to engage with video. They like being able to look at images, and they like being able to really personally communicate with people. So we're going to break sort of those down in the next couple of minutes. So a couple of things that I think are really important when we're thinking about social media. One is that people have entirely short attention spans. People are goldfish. We have an attention span of an average of 8 seconds, which really means that you have so little time to catch someone's attention. And we have to make sure that we put the right effort into not only creating good content and posting it in the right places, but really catching people's attention well. Something else that is really important to think about is people are attracted to visuals. So people are really interested in actually seeing things that are in front of them rather than being told them, right? Photos do much better on social media than status updates, and videos do better than photos. Everything that we can do to make things visual and experiential is going to be a good pillar for creating good social media. People want meaningful connections and not noise. So one thing that we've noticed over the last few years is that, Facebook used to be a place where people would go to be able to connect with their friends, but Facebook has gotten really big and people have sort of migrated to communities where they have much smaller communities. They've migrated to places like Snapchat and Instagram where you're starting building over again, but you are friends with smaller groups of people. You're not broadcasting quite as much. So not that we shouldn't use Facebook, but we really want to think about the fact that people like the meaningful connections. They like the human, the authentic elements, and not just noise in your face. But even as we're thinking about social networks, I also want to point out it's not all about us, right? We've talked about a couple of the pillars of what makes social good and important for us as consumers and for us thinking about consumers. But there's another party in this equation, and that equation is the brands. So if we think about that law of double peaks, we think about what that second peak was, right? It's about brands and making money. At the end of the day, social networks are a business and they want to make money. So even though these things about social media are things we know, people want meaningful connections, people want, good visuals. At the end of the day, the social networks still want growth and they still want revenue. So they're going to come up with ways to actually put in money-making pieces and ROI pieces for themselves into the social network equation. That's where it gets hard and difficult and a little bit complicated. So knowing that, we want to talk about kind of what do we want to make sure that we have in a good social media strategy? What does our checklist look like based on what we just discussed? So a good social strategy has engaging social media, it has visual social media, it has authentic and human social media, and then it's scaled up to actually make sure that we can keep doing what we're doing, but getting more results out of the same amount of content. So now let's start by actually talking about the foundations of a good strategy. So the reason that I start with foundations is because Surprisingly, while most of us probably know them, a lot of times we forget them. And I think it's really important to make sure that we build any conversation that we have on the foundations of a good strategy. So what makes a good strategy? So firstly, we're creating content for the right audience, not just the general audience, but the right audience. 2 is that we're hitting goals. Everybody wants either ROI or progress. Probably both, but hitting goals is really important too when we're thinking about a good strategy. And keeping people invested in our brand is another reason that we use social media. We want to keep people coming back. We want to keep people excited about who we are as a brand. And so creating a good strategy is going to make sure that it hits on all of those points. So let's go ahead and get started with the first part of that, which is find your persona. For those of you who are familiar with HubSpot marketing, and I'm sure a lot of you probably are, the persona really is the cornerstone of what we do, but I wanted to bring that out again because it really still does apply to social, and that's really important to get started on. A persona helps you dictate what networks you want to be on. It helps you dictate your voice on those networks and your tone on those networks, and it helps you dictate to whom you might be targeting if you are actually going to continue to sort of invest your social media and your energy into targeting your posts towards certain users. So as creating a persona, just kind of as a reminder, it's a fictional generalized character that has the various needs, goals, and behavior patterns among your real customers. So basically, it's a real person that we've come up with real needs, real concerns, real attitudes, real places that they actually hang out on social, and somebody that we can envision as we're actually creating this content. A couple of tips for finding your persona. Starting by asking your sales and services teams who they're talking to. What are the needs of that person? What are the challenges that they're facing? What do they know that you can actually use to incorporate into your persona? Looking at the demographics of your customers, where are they from? What are their general ages? What are their titles? Who is actually sticking around? Also, looking at demographics on existing social networks is an interesting thing to do, particularly when you're trying to decide your social strategy, especially if you find out that for whatever reason, the demographics of your social networks and the demographics of who your sales team is talking to are not matching up. That could be a really big opportunity to actually change your social media to make sure you're attracting the right people. Also, seeing what content performs best on each social channel is a good way to get to know your persona. For HubSpot, for example, if the best performing content is SEO and social media, we might think about the fact that the people who are viewing our content really are people who are struggling in those areas. And that really tells us, okay, maybe these are people who do SEO and social media. That sounds like a marketer. Let's lean more into that type of content. So now, once we have the ideas, we should be able to build a picture in our head of about whom we're actually speaking. So let's actually build the social media persona. Starting with tone, what's the general vibe of your brand? Are you fun? Are you snarky? Are you helpful? Are you relatively corporate? I suppose that's a choice you could also make. We also want to think about the language, what kinds of words you might use in social media conversations. I would even write some of those words down, write all of this down on a whiteboard as a team, so you really get on the same page about who you are as a brand, especially if you have multiple people crafting for social. It really helps to get everyone on the same page. Other things that we want to think about in terms of this social persona is the purpose. Why are you on social media in the first place? Why would your brand be on social media? Why would your persona be on social media? And what are you trying to accomplish? That can help inform some of the ways that you actually speak to the people in your audience. Maybe you're just trying to be friends. Maybe you're trying to actually direct them somewhere. These are things that kind of help nuance the actual copy that you're writing and the things that you're posting. Also, it helps to inform what networks you actually want to be on. Keeping in mind that people are all over the place. This is a sort of age distribution graph of all of the top social networks. You'll notice that depending on who you actually are trying to target and who your social persona is, they might want to be on different networks. If you are in the 18 to 24 bracket, you might decide that Snapchat is a good place for you to be. If you are in the 25 to 34 bracket, you might decide Instagram, you might decide Pinterest or Google Plus, because hey, that's still around. They keep threatening to kill Google Plus off, but it's still there. and really getting a sense for, based on that persona, based on who you're trying to target, where those people might be hanging out online. The other disclaimer behind there is it's not necessarily everywhere. Based on who you're trying to target, you will probably pick a couple of these networks, but likely not all. So also, once you know who you are on social, you can start to kind of have some fun with it. We'll hit this pro tip first, though. The best networks will always change over time. So we mentioned that you could be on one of multiple networks or multiple of many more networks. Always keep in mind that things change. Different demographics do find different networks. So that's something that we do want to keep looking at over time. Maybe not, daily, but every couple of months, or just kind of keeping an eye on the trends as we get them delivered, because we all do, thinking about where people are. But once we're on social networks, we can have a little bit of fun with it. You see, we have two examples of brands that I think do really well here. We have Old Spice and Charmin. So Old Spice is kind of a little bit snarky here. They are sort of soap and deodorant brand in the US. They're catering to that persona of people who are probably trying to look like they have confidence and look like they are able to accomplish. And they're being a little bit snarky. Charmin is a brand of bath tissue, and they're also known for being a little bit funny, having some fun cartoons. You can see that this is another example of them just being themselves on social, and these brands get a lot of attention. So once we figured out our persona, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and decide on our goals. Again, this is something that I mention because people say that they do it, but I think oftentimes don't really do it well, or don't really think about it in a way that's going to be super productive. So I'll hit on this relatively briefly, but a lot of times the most common goals on social are things like awareness, leads, traffic, or support. You can also break this down into sub-goals like video views or cost per lead or retention. Those are all certainly valid things, but I think at the very top level, you have to decide what your social is trying to do. Is it trying to drive awareness of the brand? Are you just trying to get your name out there and get people to remember you? Are you trying to actually drive conversions? Are you trying to drive traffic? Or is your brand primarily support? You can do multiple of these things, but I would suggest sort of having one top level goal. That way you can actually build the funnel that you're creating towards that, and then build sort of secondary funnels off of that. I'm a strong believer in the fact that if you really want to be hitting something well and winning at it, you should be focusing on one metric. If you're focusing on so many at once, you're really not necessarily going to be making progress in the right direction. You're going to be making half progress in some areas and not really full progress across the board. So that being said, as we work with our customers and as we think about who we are as a brand, we find that these are sort of the two most common goals seem to be awareness or leads. So we broke down kind of why you might choose to be either of these. Awareness is typically a long-term play. So we find this in sort of two scenarios. One is if you are making frequent purchases. So let's say I am interested in buying a soft drink, and I'm trying to decide between Coke and Pepsi. That's a purchase I might make frequently. And so for them, awareness play might be important because I'm going to come back and make that play. Another time awareness might be important is the opposite direction, where I might not really make a purchase for a long time, or maybe even ever, but I know enough about the brand that if I have a friend or I know somebody who actually might be interested in it, that they would actually be something or someone to whom I would recommend this brand. Awareness also, like it mentioned, is kind of a buy later play. Oftentimes the goal is recall. Lead gen, conversely, is more of a short-term play. When I say short-term play, I don't mean short-term play as in I'm trying to get them to purchase right now. I mean short-term play as in the action that I want them to take is closer to immediate. So I want them to actually give me an email. I want them to buy, buy, quote unquote, as in actually take the action of giving us something. But the goal here is oftentimes an email address. This is a different approach because we might want to create content that's going to hook much sooner rather than awareness content where you have a little bit more room to figure out what's just going to keep people delighted and excited. So I would suggest thinking about which one of these you'd rather start with, which one you kind of want to make your main goal, and then sort of building a primary funnel from that point. So now, once we've decided what our goals are, we want to go ahead and just sort of mention the fact that, build a funnel towards them and then get ready to go. So next steps given this whole section would be to build a persona and a social voice if you don't already have one for your social channel. Audit your brand against that voice. Once you know who you're actually targeting to and who you are as a social brand, go ahead and look back at your social channels and see how well you're actually measuring up against that, and see how you might want to tweak your language a little bit, perhaps in a way that it's going to make your brand a little bit more aligned with who you are. And do this as a team too, because it really helps, again, to get everyone on the same page. And then we also want to decide our metrics for success. Again, actually being aligned about the same metrics is really going to help you decide in conversations what your best next steps are in moving forward. So now that we've talked about the basics, we can move on a little bit more to getting engagement right. So I very deliberately use the word engagement because I think as we're thinking about what we want on social, engagement is a really, really important thing to be striving for. Why is that? So we'll start with this. If you think about it, there are many things that are distributed throughout the world. We have different amounts of money, we have different amount of resources, we have different amounts of access, but we all have the exact same amount of is attention. And that being said, attention is the scarcest resource on the internet. Everyone is competing for it. There are so many things on the internet these days. We as brands continue to make so many different pieces of content, and we share them as we get better at it. It even gets more crowded. So attention is something that we're all really competing equally for, and we can all sort of find a foothold in competing for attention. The other thing is, because attention is so important, you got to think about the network point of view. Networks are solving for the most relevant content, the content that's going to get attention, that's going to make you stick around, and again, so that they're going to be able to distribute those ads like we sort of mentioned before. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about HubSpot and how we learned about the metrics that we should look at, and hopefully that'll help you as well. So about 2 years ago, we were taking a look at our performance. We were looking at the month of December compared to the month of the previous December, because our goal was lead gen and we realized we weren't doing as well as we wanted. And so we looked at every place in the funnel. We worked our way back to the very top point where someone would first engage with us, and we tried to figure out what was different. What we noticed is over that time, we had people come and we had similar amounts of people who were engaging with our content. We had similar percentages of people who were following our content and then retweeting it or favoriting it. But what we lost was the percentage of people who are actually clicking through to the content. This goes to the attention point, right? Everybody wants to be seen on networks. Everyone wants to sort of share. Everyone wants you to see that they're sharing good content and favoriting good content, but that really doesn't mean that much if you're not getting the click, right? So we noticed that it used to be that for every one retweet, we'd also get one click, but we are down to now for every 2 retweets, maybe we'd get a click. That wasn't good. So we decided at that point we wanted to start focusing on Twitter on making sure that we are getting clickable lines, clickable content, rather than just asking for the retweets. We wanted to make sure to really get people to engage. This is also so relevant. See, we'll throw up that stat there when we think about Facebook. So here's a fun and also scary stat. The last time that this information came out, which is over a year ago, it hasn't come out since then. But when last reported, Facebook said that their average reach could be less than 2% for brands who have decent sized networks. That's incredibly scary when you think about it, because we're putting in all of this work and we really want people to be able to see the content that we're putting out there. So how do we actually make sure that we're getting the best reach for the content that we're putting out? So back to the kind of HubSpot story. We decided to dig in this month a little bit on the past couple of months, how we were actually doing in terms of reactions and comments and shares, all of the typical metrics, and how that was performing accordingly. And we kind of got this frustrating looking graph, right? Which says to us there's a little bit of a correlation, but it's not entirely clear who is, what posts are doing well for what reasons. We kind of have a sense, but we're still guessing a whole lot. And then we did some research and we came across a metric called consumptions, which I want to share with you. So a consumption is effectively a link click, a video view, a photo view, post, comment, like, or shares. But what it boils down to is when we're looking at consumptions, it's really looking at the differences. It's looking at these things, right? Whereas previous metrics would have broken out comments and shares and likes, these are really looking for meaningful metrics like clicks and views and plays. So we started comparing consumptions to reach and we found this trend, right? That's a lot better for us because now we can think about the fact that if we get these consumptions, that's really going to be much more directly correlated to our reach. So knowing that consumptions is about clicks, we decided, and video plays, what we decided was, rather than necessarily going as much for the shares, that we wanted to go for the consumptions and the clicks. And I think that's been highly proven to us throughout the industry as well, that clicks are really the important metric that you want to get. Because if you think about it, if you're Facebook, if you're Twitter, you can serve ads to people who are actually engaging with your content. You can't really serve ads to people who are sharing or retweeting. So clicks are going to be the metric that we want to shoot for here. So now, how do we go ahead and do that? Well, so more sort of basics again, but viewed through a new lens. So we want to focus on the right engagements, which we talked about, but here's what gets engagement. Starting with the right subjects. So back to the persona. I told you this is going to be important to come back to. What does your actual persona want to see? What topics are they looking to read about? So the good news here is that we already know how to do this if we're kind of in the inbound world, right? So the content topics are things that we think that they're going to be excited to read about. Here are some places to find those. I think network insights are really important tools. So if you're looking at something like Facebook in particular, Facebook does a really good job at letting you know, if you go to the Facebook Insights section, what the demographic breakdown is of people who are following your page in a lot of ways. So this data that's on the left is a capture of all of Facebook, but you can start to break it down by your page in particular, and you can see things like their lifestyle and the things they purchase, the video page, the Facebook pages they visit. That kind of gives you a good sense for the company that you're in. You can do a similar thing on Twitter. Twitter also has some decent insights in that area. The other thing that I suggest doing with Facebook is you can actually download the posts that you've done over the last up to 6 months. And what we started to do is download those and tag them with the topics that we've sort of included in the post so that we can get a sense of, once we start to sort those, seeing what topics are coming out on top and how well things are performing. If you don't have time to do that right away, another really good quick hit on figuring out what good topics are and what good content is using something like BuzzSumo. BuzzSumo is an app that tells you about social shares on different URLs, so you can get a sense for what you're creating or even what your competitors are creating that is actually driving people to take social actions and interact with it. I mentioned that the content that you share and that you kind of engage with is a lot of times really similar to the content that you might be searching. It's just intent, right? These are things that we want to read. If we're going to go and search for them and we like them that much, then the fact that they pop up on our Facebook feed is likely going to make us more inclined to actually want to click them. And this is something that we found too on HubSpot, is that when we started using the most trafficked posts via Google Analytics, those are the posts that were also most clicked on our social networks. And then HubSpot keywords is a good old standby. If you're trying to figure out, just like you're trying to figure out how to optimize your blog posts, you can go ahead and throw some keywords in there and see sort of what keywords are available, get a sense for what types of keywords your audience might be interested in, and come up with a plan for the types of content that you want to create around your social networks and really promote that content there. So another sort of pro tip, I'll make sure to call this out again because we just mentioned it, is that highly trafficked posts also make good social posts. Try it, you'll see what I mean. Now let's go ahead to more of what content gets good engagement. Well-written content is also extremely important for getting engagement. So what is well-written content? Well, again, it's relevant to your persona. It leverages keywords. If my persona is really interested in Excel, and I use the word Excel, that's actually going to be a good indicator that they're going to like to read the article. Spoiler alert, people are really interested in Excel, probably because so few of us are actually great at using it. But that goes to other industries as well, right? So if my persona is really interested in maintaining a garden, then there are certain garden words that I would probably want to throw into my content. And those garden words would be the same ones that I'd want to splash across social. Using short, compelling titles is also important. We mentioned people are like goldfish. Content moves pretty quickly, making sure that as we're writing our meta descriptions in particular, that they're pretty short and clear to people as they're scrolling. Adding meta descriptions when and where relevant. So meta descriptions are, if you're looking at your Facebook feed, they are the description underneath on a link, they're a description underneath the title. So the most bottom thing on your Facebook feed. Meta descriptions give people kind of good expectations about what they're going to get when they click through. And they really can be aided or used as an aid to get people excited about the content that you're posting and wanting to click. Also, content that evokes emotion is content that is going to be content that's clicked and shared. People react to things that emote them, particularly things that make them really happy or really sad. And so creating a situation in which people are emotive is actually going to be really good for getting them to click. Here are some more fun sort of facts around that in a really hard-hitting way. Negative superlatives performed 30% better than positive ones when used in a post. So if we're writing a post, if we were to use the word best, people are going to be more likely to click a headline with the word best in it because they want to be the best. But they're going to be even more likely to click the word worst because nobody wants to be the worst. In the sort of best possible way, getting emotion out of people is going to get them to want to interact with your content, want to click your content, and really spread that content around. So other things that really help in this area are certain words. Our friends at Buffer, again, they do a lot of good research, came up with some of the most clickable words in social media from a study I think they did in the last couple of years. And they found that words like you and free, these are all words that we would click, right? Because these are words that give us a sense that we are going to do better at something quickly, or we're going to understand something. I'd suggest trying to use some of these words in your next social posts and kind of see how they perform, but it really does help make your social posts stronger. The other thing that I would say too is that as you're creating content, using superlatives, using these words are really helpful, but we also want to actually speak like whatever persona we've decided, and we want to speak to our audience as humans. We'll talk a little bit more about humans and being authentic later, but kind of what I'm getting at is moving away from the really corporate sounding posts and really moving into posts that sound like you're talking to somebody, particularly when they're also using these words. So other ways that our posts get engagement, posts that are optimized for social really help. So what does that mean? Well, firstly, mostly that means that what works on one channel might not work quite as well on the other. So Facebook, for example, the videos do much better on Facebook. Photos do much better on Twitter. That probably goes to the nature of how people actually interact with those platforms. Something for us to keep in mind as we're creating content is that the strategy should not be the same on each channel. Here's an example of it from HubSpot's perspective, right? So I'll call out two that, one, here's the meta description below here where it says learn how to plan and schedule social media content. We'll also call out that we used one of those words that we had suggested to use. Can anybody spot it? It's the word free template. And we also sort of at the top gave some really not questions. We weren't asking people about their lives, but we were really trying to get them to feel something by using a declarative statement. People react really well to this kind of post because it kind of tells them something that they need to do, and then it gives them a really good resource for going ahead and accomplishing that. So on Facebook, we would use a post like this. On Twitter, you see to the right, we might actually post the same thing, but a little bit differently. So on Twitter, we've noticed that GIFs work pretty well, which are something that is not quite as friendly on Facebook. Facebook doesn't handle GIFs so well. But on Twitter, we found that using GIFs and really catching people's attention in that visual way as they're scrolling through and really relating to them in an emotive way. Both of these are about creating social media calendars, right? Relating to them with a GIF was actually really good on Twitter. We posted the same thing on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a network where people are looking for things a little bit differently. They're not looking to be quite as amused. They're looking for very quick wins. So for this, we kept it very simple. And we knew that people were only going to see this image very quickly, but we wanted them to understand by looking at it what they were going to get from it. So here they were going to get a social media calendar. We included an image of that. And that also performed really well for us on LinkedIn. So again, we'll call that out one more time because I feel like it's important, but start by building out social strategies per each network. Don't post the same piece of content with the exact same description on each network. Really start to think about what works on those networks for that type of content. So the next thing that we're going to talk about too is content that gets engagement is visually engaging. So a couple stats on that one. Visual content is 40 times more likely to be shared on social media social media channels than non-visual content. That should be something that we kind of instinctively know already, but I just wanted to make sure to call it out because it's really important. Another interesting stat is that 85% of the reason that you choose to buy a product is color. I just think that that's generally interesting for dinner table conversation, but I also think that it relates really well back to what we're talking about. Color is important. I showed you that post that we did on LinkedIn, and you might have noticed that it was blue. We took a look at our posts and we started testing color, and we noticed that there were certain colors that performed better for us than others. Those happened to be blue and green. But color really is something that we don't want to take too lightly because it can really make a big impact, and visual content can make a big impact as well. So a couple more steps in creating a good image. Keep the image simple and a clear focus. We don't want to have too many different things going on an image because then it's really hard to figure out where to look. There should be one central focal point of the image, or one word, or one something that somebody scrolling past can understand very quickly, and that's going to be something that people are going to react to much better. We want to find the colors and styles that work for you. If you are a company that's sort of down the road enough to have a brand style guideline, ideally these will be colors that would work in your brand style. You can still experiment with some of those, but really getting a sense of what colors perform well is going to be something that will really help in the long run. And using under 20% of an image to be text. So if you're promoting this on Facebook in particular, Facebook does not allow images to be promoted that are over 20% text. But it's also just good practice. We don't really want to spend our time reading text on images. We want to spend our time processing the image very quickly, and that's something that our brain just does instinctively. So keeping the text minimal is going to be really helpful for us there. I'll also go ahead and call out video. We're not going to talk too much about video today, although I do love this topic. So if you do have questions, certainly tweet us with them or tweet me directly. But we'll call out a couple of things that are important if you are creating video for social for capturing attention. One is catching the user's attention within the first 3 to 5 seconds. Facebook counts a view, the number that you see underneath the video on Facebook, as 3 seconds. But that doesn't necessarily do a whole lot for us. So we mentioned that, we want people to engage with our content. So typically our team aims for the longer views. But either way, if you're going to put energy into a story and you want it to be told, you really want people to stick around. Capturing a user's attention in the first 3 to 5 seconds is really, really key. And you can do that with things like quick frame changes or introducing the story very quickly. I'd also suggest not having your bumper be at the beginning of a video because that takes up valuable real estate and someone won't know that fast whether or not they want to watch. Using text or closed captioning is also really important. So I'll mention this stat in a moment, but most videos are not actually watched with sound. So adding an SRT file is effectively closed captioning. You can actually now generate this automatically on Facebook. Once you've posted the post, it will allow you, if you go back to edit the post, to actually hit generate. And what it'll generate for you is a text file. It's not always that accurate, so I'd suggest going back through it and making sure to make any corrections to it. Yesterday, I was working on one that we had, and it was taking the word Snapchat, for example, and making them 2 separate words, things like that. We want to go back and check. But using text either baked into the video to tell a story, or adding closed captioning later is really going to help somebody as they're scrolling past figure out what they're watching. Also, telling a simple story is really huge. People should understand very quickly why they're watching and what they're watching about. Again, attention spans are short, so being able to make it simple and knowing what the story arc is pretty early on is going to keep people around for longer. Providing a good title or video teaser. So even if you are posting the actual video, you do want the title that's above the video to complement it well. You want to make sure that people sort of see the whole post together and that it all flows very well together when creating video. This is the stat that I mentioned before. I think it's fascinating. 85% of videos on Facebook are watched without sound. This is why we want to include SRT files and closed captioning. If you think about it, that means that the vast majority of videos that you create, you want to assume that someone's not going to be watching with sound. And next time you're on Facebook, go ahead and see how many you watch without sound. I bet you it'll be quite a lot. So the other thing that we want to do to get engagement is to do authentic and human content. So we are humans. We like connecting with other humans. We like seeing behind the scenes. I personally am a big fan of a lot of shows. I'll go ahead and admit it, they're reality shows. But the thing that I'm making about them is that a lot of these shows have started doing reunion specials at the end. But as they're doing the reunion specials, they started adding behind the scenes content to the reunion specials. They're starting to notice, as are we on social, as our brands, that people really enjoy behind the scenes content. We like to see people being human. So we'll spend a minute talking about being authentic and human on social. Go ahead and just call that out one more time. People like content that's being human. Whoop, excuse me, you can see my calendar now. So anyway, moving back on, here's a very human point for you. We're going to actually talk about, Facebook. Personal sharing on Facebook was down 21% in the last year. That's one of the reasons they started introducing more video, introducing more live video. They're thinking that this type of behavior is going to bring people back. This is also the type of thing that makes people migrate to networks like Instagram and Snapchat. People want these more curated networks, and they like that these smaller networks like Instagram and Snapchat allow for that curation. On Facebook, we're also looking for those opportunities. So being human kind of entails the following. One is participating in relevant conversation. This is one of my favorite tweets by Arby's. They're calling out Pharrell, who was, I believe, wearing a hat that looked kind of like an Arby's hat. They're participating in the conversation around the Grammys, which for those of you who aren't familiar is an American awards show, and really just kind of making themselves known in a very human and present and funny way about an event that people are already talking about. But participating in conversation and doing it quickly, nobody knew Pharrell was going to be wearing that hat, and then he wore it and they reacted. That's a very human element. And being able to incorporate those gives people sort of a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings about your networks. Responding like a human is also hugely important. So this is particularly if you're thinking about supporting people on social. But I think if you have a social brand, you should be prepared that you will get questions, and you should have a plan for responding to them, whether that's as a marketer or whether you have a support team that does it. You may also notice that there are some brands who don't do that enough or don't do that well, particularly some recently in the news. That really creates an impact, and people do expect you to respond very quickly on social. So actually being able to respond as a human is really important. And even though it doesn't necessarily contribute to your ROI directly, it does contribute overall to your retention and to the ability of people to actually enjoy you as a brand. So another way to be a human too is to show real people in real moments. We found that when comparing the same content of video for, we compared the same content of video, and we had one example of the video where it was a human face talking. You see, we have our baked in text there. And we had one example of the video that was purely animated. The videos that did better were people who were talking at the camera and really engaging. Side point there, obviously your mileage will vary. Take a look at your own content if you want to experiment, but actually being able to show people in real moments, actually being able to show people who are engaging with the camera is a really good way to use video and to provide that experience for brands. This is also something that I think is fascinating. They did a study about people and reacting to faces. They called it the sort of Jennifer Aniston effect. And the reason is because in the study, what they did was they took a look at people's brains as they were looking at content. And then they showed them faces and the brain regions lit up. And then they showed them Jennifer Aniston's face and people's brains were on fire. And keep in mind that the study was performed at a time during when Friends was super popular. So everybody knew who Jennifer Aniston was. The point that I'm trying to make is faces and human do really well. Familiar faces do even better. So especially if you're thinking about being a human, being a brand, having a presence on social, you should also start thinking about whether there is somebody who can be sort of a front person for your brand, be a face that people will connect with and that they will remember and see from time to time. All right, so we've talked a lot about that. We'll summarize authentic on social. So that is starting with your persona, creating content for them. I told you I'd mention persona a bunch. Talking to your audience like they're people. Thinking about when people could read your post. This is kind of a new one. A lot of conventional social media posts, one of the posts that we find that people go crazy for is what is the best time of day to post on social? And usually what I tell people is you should run as far away from those posts as possible because one, if everybody's posting at that same time, then you're going to face a lot of competition. But two is because your brand might not have the same success at the same times as other brands. Your brand might find that you have the most success on the weekends, even if you are a brand that posts about work-related content. You might find that your best content actually does well at night. We find that people spend a lot of time lying in bed, scrolling through and looking at their social media. And so it's not a terrible time to actually post content at night. Or at 4 o'clock in the morning, we find that people, have content has a little bit of time to gain steam. Again, this is sort of a your mileage may vary thing, but it really is true that you should experiment and you should figure out what works best for your content and your audience. Also, recording videos is a good way to be authentic. Now, let's take a look at what the next steps are here. I'd suggest next steps for you here would be establishing a baseline, particularly for your clicks. Remember, this is a really long section, so this is going a little bit far back. Establishing a baseline for your clicks and engagement, seeing how well you're doing there. Crafting brand messages to be human and engaging. Testing out wording, messaging, even colors on your posts. Ensuring that you have a process for supporting folks on social. Anytime you have a channel that's public, you should do this. And then experiment with some videos, some engaging media, and some emerging media as well. So let's go ahead and talk about emerging media now. For emerging media, when I'm talking about emerging media, what I'm talking about is things that are kind of new, right? We talked about the law of the double peak and how there were some new brands or brands that were newer versus the brands that were a little bit more established. So emerging networks are things to me like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, even video is slightly different, right? Because you have different resources for that. And then messengers and bots, particularly on Facebook-owned networks like Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp. So emerging networks really are key because what they're doing is they are just providing a new way to interact with people. They're observing behavior and they are providing a chance for you to reach people in a new way. And usually they catch on because they're doing something right. But there are good reasons and bad reasons to be on these emerging networks. The good reason is because it's right for your brand, right? The good reason is because you've done research, you've taken a look, you've made a calculated decision that you're going to try it, and it really is a good place for your network to try. The bad reason is because everybody's doing it. Those of you who know the adage, if somebody if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it? Right? Not to be so morbid, but just wanted to kind of call out the comment here because just because everyone else is doing it doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you, and it doesn't mean it's right for your resources either. So here are a couple of questions that I pose to people as they're thinking about emerging networks and whether even they want to create their own new social networks within our company. We ask them things like, who is your demographic? Where are they? We've already talked a little bit about that for ourselves. We want to make sure that we pose that for each new network and each new person. Where is your audience spending their time? Are they spending time on Snapchat? No, well, then maybe we shouldn't make up a persona to be on Snapchat just because everyone else is. Are they spending time on Instagram and we're not there? Okay, maybe that's something that we want to take a look at. want to ask what kinds of content performs well on other channels, and can we repurpose it? Can we actually find a way to create content for that channel based on what we know? And really, can we iterate from there, having a process in place? How much time and energy do we have to build a new audience? This one is key, and I don't think people think about it enough. Building up a new audience takes time. You're here listening to me speak, and I appreciate that, because you're trying to learn how to do this better. But this is time that you're taking out of your day. And now you have to go craft the content and post the content. Think about how you would feel if you had to add another channel. I think emerging media really is a question that you need to ask yourself too, is do you have the time, energy, and bandwidth to be able to contribute to that? And one of the ways that you can figure that out is, what is your measure of success? We talked about measures of success early on in this conversation, but you should figure out what your measure of success would be on emerging media channels. Is it views? That's something that you can probably measure. Is it brand awareness? That's going to be harder to measure, particularly on things like Snapchat, because there's no calculated metric. There are barely any metrics at all. So figuring out what your metric of success is will help you figure out whether or not you are able to build the bandwidth to drive towards it. And then once you know that, you also need to know how to determine when it's worthwhile. Something that I always say to people too is, you need to know when to stop. Given all of the information that you have, it might be that you try something and it doesn't work. You should decide at what point you're going to decide whether this is worth it for you and whether it's worth it to keep investing bandwidth. I think that's important to decide at the beginning as well, and have that expectation for yourself. So that being said, I will say this. Facebook Live, I think, is a good network if you can try it. We've noticed that our content actually does get 2.5 times the reach of other content on Facebook Live. So it's something that I would say, if you do have the bandwidth, it might be worth trying. Another thing that I would say too is, if you're looking at live video, I would consider the following. One, that you should have a reason that your content should be live. If there's not a reason that should be live, then you might want to consider doing it pre-produced instead. Another thing that I would consider with live is, live works best when it feels either organic or pre-produced. So we talked about feeling authentic. That's really important. With live content, you can also make it really well produced. So go ahead and think about what would work best for you and your brand. If you're ready to try it, I would suggest with emerging content that the best bets for you would be a Facebook Live or an Instagram Stories, just because those two networks scale really well, and because a lot of audiences are already on there. They're also really good to get analytics from. So if you want the actual real hard-hitting advice of where I would start, regardless of where my networks are, I think these are two good ones to look into for kind of what you get from them. Next steps on this process: evaluate whether networks are right for your brand, and decide what success would look like to you and how you're going to benchmark that for yourselves. So solving for scale, this is a lot of work that we are going to be putting into these networks. How do we actually amplify it? Because none of us have unlimited time. That's very clear. So couple of tips on that one. One is create a schedule, particularly if you are working across different groups, or if you're working with networks like Snapchat or Instagram that don't actually allow you to schedule this content ahead of time. You want to keep very clear who's doing what at what time. So something like a Google Calendar might help, or an Excel spreadsheet, or if you have another task management software that you're using, creating a schedule is really important to make sure you know who is doing what. Repurposing and reusing content where possible. A couple of ideas for that would be things like creating Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat stories from your most popular blog posts. Notice those are all called stories. Doing some Q&A to promote existing webinars and live streams that you have. Creating as much content as you can from those webinars and live streams. Who knows what might come from this conversation today. Creating compelling images to cross-promote content is also something that you can do. Let's say you have a Facebook Live. You might want to create a concept on Instagram that shows people that they can come and watch that Facebook Live. So those are all really good ways to actually promote content. Other things that you can do are create templates and style guidelines. So it is really to your advantage to actually create templates, especially if you're testing them out a little bit, to see, to be able to make content faster. If you have style guidelines too for your brand, that's great, but you might want to make them for social as well. Approximately how much text you want on images, what colors you want people to use. Creating these kinds of things help to scale a lot faster. Using paid is something that we're not going to talk about today, although I do hear that coming next time, you're going to get a bigger insight into paid. But if you do have the budget to be able to do that, paid is a really good way to actually start amping up your content spread as well. So tips for getting started, we'll just run through these real quick because we talked about a lot of next steps content. Here's where I would think about it. I would start with your persona first, absolutely and always. I would look then at your metrics for success and be honest with yourselves about it. And find your most successful content and ways to tweak that content so that you can repurpose it for social and try again. And then decide if you have bandwidth to experiment with emerging networks. I think this really is all things that you probably are already doing to some degree, but taking a step back and taking a look at doing this well is really going to be to your advantage, and being able to really tweak what you have to in your networks to do really good social. That's all I have today. Does anybody have any questions?
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for that brilliant presentation, Chelsea. I think our viewers will all agree that there were a lot of actionable pieces of advice in there and a huge amount of helpful insights. So we've had a couple of questions come in on Twitter.
Sure.
And if anyone has any other questions, really quickly tweet us at #InsideHubSpotMarketing. And while people are doing that, I just have one question for you, Chelsea.
Yes.
So we have a lot of agencies and agency marketers and owners watching today. How would you advise that an agency comes across as human on social media? Because you mentioned, being authentic and being human. What advice would you have for these agencies?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's being authentic and being human is sort of something that everyone can do. And by that, I mean, you can always use language that's going to be more authentic and human. You can always empathize with real people's problems. You can always sort of showcase how you are operating as a brand and how you are learning from that. And I think it's less of as much what content I produce though, and more of just, I'm using words that show that I empathize. I am using, conversations. I'm jumping in on a conversation that shows that I have valuable insight to give, and really just using social media as a tool to relate to people is something that I think you can do no matter what kind of content you produce or company you work at.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So just to take one or two of our Twitter questions here. So Samantha Alfred at Sam Alfred Tweets has asked quite an interesting question about like managing the amount of content that you, I suppose, post in different social media. And she asked, how do you manage scheduling regular posts? Do you keep them in a spreadsheet? And do you schedule manual or daily? How does that all work?
Sure, and that's a great question. I think it depends on the tools that you have. So, for example, if you have the HubSpot tool, there's a social component within the HubSpot tool that actually allows you to schedule posts in advance. There are several other vendors that you can look into that allow similar functionality. If you don't have the budget for one of those tools, a lot of networks, including Twitter actually, which I've just realized in the more recent months, allow you to schedule content on network. So that's certainly something that you can do as well. What I would suggest doing is planning your content out for a couple of weeks, starting with your big chunk pieces. So the posts that you want to reuse a couple times, the evergreen content, the campaigns that you want to launch, and start planning that out maybe a month in advance, and then start filling in more content. Maybe that even is in a spreadsheet as you get closer. And then leave yourself also maybe a couple of spaces to iterate quickly. So, if you have something that you need to release quickly, or you have a blog post that did really well that you want to promote again, leave yourself a little bit of room for that. And if you do have to do that in a spreadsheet, you can certainly do that in a spreadsheet and kind of go ahead and schedule that closer too. I would try as much as you can to schedule ahead of time though, because you don't want to be consistently having to worry about that throughout the day.
Great, thanks very much for that, Chelsea. So we have a question from @InboundSys. They asked, what's the ideal frequency of tweeting ads? And we're actually not going to talk about that because, as you mentioned, we have another whole session coming up around paid social media and taking advantage of advertising on different social media. So we're going to cover that in a different session. And the last question we'll take is from Social Marketing Queen, which is at Caitlin Rhodes. She asked, do you think it's best practice to post on a business Facebook page more than once a day? And I think that goes back to, as you said yourself, it's different for everyone, that you should experiment. Would I be correct in saying that?
I think you would absolutely be correct in saying that. I will also add to that, I think best practice is hard, right? It's more about expectations and more about whether you have the right content. I wouldn't stretch and post content that's not relevant if you don't have that content to post, because that just sort of looks silly. But I actually find that if you can post a couple of times a day, as long as you're getting strong engagement on that, that can really be beneficial. We try and post these days 2 times a day and then 1 video. So for an ultimate 3. But I think, again, you're right, David, your mileage may vary. Try it out. But I don't think it's a problem to post more than once a day.
Cool. Perfect. Well, just again, thanks so much again for this, Chelsea. It's been brilliant. I think our viewers would agree that it's been very, very helpful and a huge amount of insight and knowledge to everybody watching. Let us know what you think about the first webinar of our Inside HubSpot Marketing series by tweeting us at hashtag Inside HubSpot Marketing. We're going to have a number of these over the coming months with different people from our marketing team, letting you guys know what we do, how we do it, and how you guys can apply it to your businesses or agencies. So yeah, thanks again, Chelsea. We're going to close it now for today, and we'll be hosting another one very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.